Gold, ostriches, and eating babies all today on an episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Lamentations chapter 3 verse 37 all the way to the end of chapter 5. And tomorrow we'll begin the book of Ezekiel. I can't wait for that. So I guess let's dive right into the text for today. Now right off the bat here, verses 37 through 40 and verses 40 to 47, Jeremiah shifts to the first person plural pronoun here with us and our for the rest of this chapter. In these verses, his representative role is made plain. He will lead his people in a confession of their sins and exhort them to return to the Lord. Now, verses 52 to 54, water flooded over my head. What did that mean? Well, it turns out this is just a metaphor for all sorts of stresses. It wasn't just meaning waterboard me or pour water over my head. It was a metaphor for stresses that we have in our lives and everywhere. Verses 55 through 66, these final 12 verses of the chapter are a prayer for deliverance, which is how chapters 1 and 2 also ends. So chapter 3 here is also going to end with that. Jeremiah called on God's name from the depth of the pit, and God heard Jeremiah's plea. His words for assurance were, "Do not be afraid," which is in the Bible hundreds of times. So do not be afraid, do not fear. We hear that a lot from God, and the reason is it's all in his hands, not ours, really. So there's no reason to fear as long as we trust him, right? Right, I think so. So we get to chapter 4. This chapter is actually an alphabetic acrostic as well. So is chapter 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 4 is no different. The only difference here is chapter 3 had 3 verses per letter, and chapter 4 is only going to have 1 verse per letter. So there's only 22 verses in this chapter. Now, God's people, it says here, were worth their weight in gold. But I found it interesting that the prophet Jeremiah here used 3 different terms for gold. He first used the general term gold, then he uses the term fine gold, and then he uses the term pure gold. At least that's the way it's translated in the CSB. King James, it just has gold, and it has fine gold twice. But that second word is typically a little different than fine gold. It actually means pure gold, not just fine gold. So that's what the holy nation was before God. They were gold, right? But now, smeared with sin, they were regarded as clay jars, like pieces of shattered pottery. They were kind of broken. They were not whole anymore. Although it just says that how they were regarded as clay jars, the work of the potter's hands, but we all know what happens to pots. So, chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, it speaks of jackals and ostriches, and I'm like, what in the world does this have to do with ostriches? Does this mean like they're going to stick their head in the sand like an ostrich does? What does it mean? What does that reference to ostriches really mean? It was actually kind of simple. It's simply because ostriches were known for the habit of laying eggs and then leaving them. We actually read about that previously in Job chapter 39. I didn't remember, but it was in verses 13 through 18 about that. So if you think about how many times these horrific things has happened where they were forced to eat their own young at some points. In chapter 4, verse 10, they actually mentions this again, where it says, "The hands of compassionate women have cooked their own children. They became their food during the destruction of my dear people." So this destruction and this besieging was so terrible and horrific that the effects of the famine during the siege of Jerusalem even had compassionate women who under normal circumstances would never think of doing such a thing. But here they cooked their own children for food. We read about that previously in chapter 2 as well. So that brings us to chapter 5. Now, chapter 5 here, it has 22 verses as well, but it is not an alphabetic acrostic in Hebrew. It's kind of as if things had gotten so bad that even the poetry here got kind of chaotic in a way. But it starts out here in verse 1. And it says, Lord, remember what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. To remember, you got to keep this in mind in Scripture. The word remember, it's never just calling something to mind. In other words, it's not just let me think about what just happened. It also involves a corresponding action. So there's a remembrance and action. Anytime you see the word remember, there's an action included here, not just a thought. All right, so keep that in mind as you read the rest of chapter 5. So you get to verses 11 through 14, and hardly anyone in Jerusalem was left unscathed at this point. It was pretty bad. And in verse 16, the fallen crown symbolized Israel's loss of honor and glory. The reason was clear. It was because we have sinned. Now, I have some final thoughts on this chapter. This is a little food for thought for you. Rebellion against God, it cannot go on indefinitely. That is clear. However, even when the punishment or the loss is deserved, intense expressions of grief are a very normal part of the human experience. There is no joy in seeing God punish disobedient people, at least not to me. There's only sorrow. Times of intense suffering teach us to turn to God in prayer. Times of national catastrophe and personal disaster also call for steadfast trust in God. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click that like button, subscribe button, the follow button. Click that little boxing glove so we can rumble together on Rumble. And of course, turn your notification bell on so you can get notified the next time I upload video, which will be tomorrow, for another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.